Happy Thursday, everybody. I am Jeremy Birmingham. That's Andrew Ellis. This is Talking Stuff, the Ohio State football recruiting podcast brought to you by The Podcast. It is big game weekend in Columbus. Big noon kickoff is in town. ESPN College Game Day is in town. The number 6 Penn State Nittany Lions are in town. And about 85 different recruits and their families are expected in town as well. And so that is going to be the focus of this episode of Talking Stuff. We're just doing a preview of who's expected in town, who the biggest visitors are, what the biggest storylines are for Ohio State as the Buckeyes host their first really important recruiting weekend of the 2023 football season. The next one is about 3 weeks away when Michigan State comes to town, but this one's a little bit different. It's a noon game, so that means a lot of players are really having to go out of their way to get to town in time for the game. It also means some guys that we had hoped would be in town will not be, but that is the way it goes when you are subjected to the whims of Fox and their big noon kickoff. Andrew, just dive right in. One official visitor this weekend only. That is Amaris Williams, the Florida defensive end commitment from North Carolina. It is an interesting visit for him. Buckeyes offered 3 weeks ago. This visit was planned almost immediately after. There's been, I think, a little bit of concern from Amaris Williams, or maybe at least not concern from him, but things that are trying to be presented to him that Ohio State doesn't really need him in this class, and it's just gravy. And I don't know where that comes from, but it is something that I've heard being speculated. I'm sure it probably comes from the Florida staff trying to convince this kid that he's not a priority for Ohio State because they offered late. But we have talked at length this cycle and last about the need for defensive ends for Ohio State. And it seems like a pretty important guy for the Buckeyes to not just make a good connection with this weekend, but to leave this weekend feeling like they have the upper hand on Florida.
Yeah, really big visit. I know the Florida side seems concerned about this one, and they have for a few weeks ever since Ohio State really entered the picture. Just be another great piece for Larry Johnson, not the 220-pound edge type that they're out for, but another guy who probably can play defensive end. I know we talked about his tape and how he doesn't necessarily look like an inside guy. He looks like somebody that can probably stick on the outside in college, and he's a good player. So getting him up here is huge, and I'm going to be interested to see where things stand Monday-ish, Tuesday-ish of next week with this one.
I think what people will look at in a list of 80-some prospects and see one official visitor and maybe feel like a touch of disappointment. The Buckeyes, and for the last few months, we'd had Booker Pickett on this list for this weekend. He's announced his commitment on Thursday night. It's not Ohio State. From what I understand, the Buckeyes had sort of moved in a different direction. And the plan, there was at least still a conversation about visiting this weekend for Booker, but within the last couple of weeks, that changed for Ohio State, and now he's committed elsewhere. We're recording this, so I don't know where it is. It's probably Miami, but it could have been Florida State. It's one of those two, I'm pretty sure, heading into it. Deshaun Warner, a 4-star defensive end, Kansas commitment, who is from Arizona. He was offered by Ohio State a week ago, and there was some conversation about him visiting this weekend for the Penn State game. That's not going to happen. It probably more likely will occur the weekend of the Michigan State game if he decides to make that trip. So all eyes this weekend on Amaris Williams.
Yep, all eyes on that one. And then you got to get the Kansas commit on campus here, and I mean, really, those could be the final. In a perfect world, those could be the final two pieces to Larry Johnson's puzzle. I know it seems like the Marquise Lightfoot his ship has sailed. We talked about that one the other week. So it seems like it's these two guys right now, unless I'm forgetting somebody big that's slipped my mind.
The only other guy that I think is still in the conversation, and I don't even want to talk about it because I don't want people to think that it's like really percolating into anything important or anything real at this point, would be Dylan Stewart. Just because the South Carolina struggles seem to be real, and there's been some scuttlebutt about maybe the guys that have been recruiting him could not be a part of the Gamecock staff next year. I know that there's still at least been conversation between Ohio State and Dylan Stewart. And I guess I'm just going to say I wouldn't be surprised if he made an official, or if he made a visit in November at some point, but it's not like really to that point where it's even worth talking about. But we're talking about defensive ends, so we may as well. Now, again, one official visitor. 18 Ohio State commitments are expected in town this weekend. The ones that are not of the class of 2024 would be Justin Scott, would be Leroy Roker, the safety who just committed a week ago, Jalen McClain, who visited for the Maryland game, and I'm missing one more. Who is it? Let's take.
I can't even remember.
Well, here's the list, right? So we'll go down the list here. Everyone. Eric Mensah, who's visited twice this year for Ohio State. So you're talking 2 safeties, 2 defensive linemen that will not be in town for the Buckeyes. But as you can see on the list here, it's a pretty good group. Aaron Nolan getting a chance to connect not just once again with the Ohio State coaches, but every single member of the offensive recruiting class that is committed currently to the Buckeyes in the class of 2024 will be in town. That is pretty big, especially Jeremiah Smith getting a chance to spend some time with Mylan Graham and Jeremiah McClellan. Those two hung out last weekend at the Purdue game when they watched Ohio State play in West Lafayette. And as you see on the list there, people, there's one unofficial visitor that I've got noted, and his name is Gabe Van Sickle. He's a Northwestern commit. He's an offensive lineman, about 6'5", 300 pounds from up in the Grand Rapids, Michigan area. I don't know that there's anything to really watch there, but the fact is Ohio State's asked him to come down to visit for the Penn State game. So that seems fairly meaningful. It does not mean one thing or another in the Jordan Seaton battle. I think Van Sickle is a guy that maybe could be seen as a potential replacement for Mark Nave. If you watch this kid's tape, it's pretty violent and it looks like what you want an offensive lineman's tape to look like. There is good football up in the Grand Rapids, Michigan area. So definitely something to watch. I just by happenstance began to have a conversation with this young man 2 days ago. And then I asked him if he'd heard from Ohio State. He said he had. I said, what are they saying? He said, well, they've just talked to me about maybe coming down to visit for a game. And I said, well, I know you're committed to Northwestern and all, but if Ohio State asks you to come to a game, it's pretty worth something, right? And I said, so have you talked about which game you're coming to? And he said, yeah, I'm coming to the Penn State game. I go, okay, well, this is how these conversations go. So something to watch, but not an offer at this point yet, but he is on the list. Andrew, as you look at this list of players, what's the storyline that's most important for you in the class of 2024 this weekend?
I mean, I think some of these guys, you've got other schools coming after. Obviously, Jeremiah McClellan's one. Oregon and Missouri are coming after him. And then you got a guy like Jordan Lyle who visited, I think it was Miami or Florida State recently. I mean, just kind of reminding those guys like why you committed to Ohio State in the first place, kind of let them be around the other commits and just kind of keep that core group in place. I don't think anybody's on red alert right now or flip watch or any of that stuff, but there's certainly schools coming after a lot of these guys, and understandably so, since Ohio State has one of the best classes in the country per usual. So
the Buckeyes have used these big recruiting weekends each of the last few years. One of them every cycle, they seem to just say, hey, every commit, get back in town and let's make it a family type day. Obviously, you're going to have a lot of uncommitted kids in town, but for the class of 2024, which is almost finished as it is, this is an opportunity for the Buckeyes to just get all those kids together and a chance to spend some time together. Jeremiah McClellan is interesting. Again, he did visit Oregon 3 weeks ago. He visited Missouri 2 weeks ago. On Thursday, Ryan Wingo, 5-star wide receiver from Missouri, announced his commitment date of October the 25th. That's like a week from now. And it's almost certainly going to be Missouri as you start to see crystal balls and future casts and all the other things roll in for the Tigers. There is a lot of confidence in Missouri that if they land Ryan Wingo alongside Williams and Winari, that they will be able to flip Jeremiah McClellan. So it's a pretty important weekend, I think, for McClellan to be in town with Brian Hartline, with Jeremiah Smith, with Mylan Graham, to really figure out where he fits in this puzzle, to get a sense of what's happening down the road in the wide receiver room. But it's also worth noting that he's also expected and on the visitors list for the November 11th game against Michigan State. So this should be one of 2 trips in 3 weeks for McClellan as Brian Hartline looks to stave that off. So class of 2024 is not the real focus for the weekend as far as Ohio State's recruiting effort. Certainly it is a weekend for bonding. It is a weekend for relationship building. But what the Buckeyes are really hoping to do this week is crank up in the class of 2025. And it is a really, really good group of players in the class of 2025. It's been knocked down a little bit by guys that have canceled in the last few days, like Fahim Delane, the safety from Maryland, like London Merritt, defensive end from Georgia, like Nasir Wyatt, linebacker from California, Mater Dei High School. I don't know the explanation or the reason for all those cancellations, but I have been told some of it is just because of the travel and getting into town for a noon start. Andrew, this is the first opportunity for Blake Woodby, Tavian St. Clair, and Javen Boggs in the class of 2025 to get together. But as I wrote about on Wednesday at ohiostate.rivals.com, it really, to me, is the weekend for Tim Walton and for Perry Eliano to make a move in the class of 2025. And as we look at this visitor list, you will see why, even with Fahim Delane off of it. You've got 5-star cornerback Devin Sanchez. On Thursday, it was announced that Jonah Williams, a 5-star safety from Texas, is very likely to make the trip. You've got Dorian Brew coming back from Texas, returning to Ohio for this game. You've got Trey McNutt coming to town. You've got Mark Zachary coming to town. You've got Blake Woodby coming to town. Like, all of a sudden, that defensive backfield, these are the biggest names on the board for the Buckeyes, and that's a huge group.
Yeah, I mean, you've got all the heavy hitters for 2025 in the defensive backfield, minus Fahim Delane, like you just said. But that's a star-studded list right there. Devin Sanchez, maybe the number one top of the board defensive player for the 2025 class, and I've been watching some of his social media antics that have been alluded to on the forum, and he definitely
no. They're only antics when they are negative.
Yeah, that's true.
What you've been watching is his social media behavior, not antics. Yes. To be clear, it is interesting on his Instagram account. Like, he's got Best in America listed on there, and I mean, he wears Ohio State gloves all the time. I've made no bones about it. I think the Buckeyes are if they're not the leader, they are one of the leaders for Devin Sanchez. He is getting to be pretty close with Dorian Brew, and I think it's interesting to have all these guys in town together. Mark Zachary, again, like that. These are the names to know in the secondary, but it's not just the secondary. Look at the linebacker group of Justin Hill and Eli Lee from Ohio, but also big time linebacker Madden Faremo from California, Elijah Melendez from Florida, Anthony Sacca from Pennsylvania. Even without Nasir Wyatt from Mater Dei, like, this is a really good group. Ohio State is in a position where I think that they are the leader, obviously, for Eli Lee. I don't think that that's the case when it comes to Justin Hill, but Elijah Melendez from Florida told me 2 weeks ago Ohio State was the number one on his list, and Anthony Sacca is from St. Joe's Prep in Philadelphia, the hometown school for Marvin Harrison and the school where Kyle McCord played. So, like, there's some relationships going here. These are not the be-all, end-all linebacker in that class, because Ohio State's still really interested in TJ Alford from Florida, who's expected for the Michigan State game. But for Jim Knowles and James Laurinaitis, like, this is the first weekend to really put it on display, because I think, and it's still early to say this definitively, but I think they could look for 4 linebackers in the class of 2025.
That would be a hefty number, I guess. Yeah. Hill, who did you say is probably the competition for him then, if Ohio State's not leading?
There's some family ties, family fandom toward Alabama that really has changed the perception just a skosh of that. Now, I'm not saying Ohio State is not in a good position. I'm not saying that he was certainly going to go somewhere else, but I don't think that relationship has been where the Buckeyes would have liked it to be. He didn't camp this summer and little things like that. So this is a chance to fix that or to really get it righted. Now, on the flip side of that, it's an unofficial visit weekend for a huge game. So you don't always know how much time individuals are going to get with the coaches, especially the kids who are not traveling from out of state. They generally can get in and out of town on the same day. So maybe there's not quite the opportunity to build relationships or to spend time chatting with coaches, but it's still very important for Justin Hill to be on Ohio State's campus. Now, if you look at the 25 list, what's interesting, there's really only one offensive lineman that I have listed. I know there's going to be more offensive linemen, but that's Carter Lowe from Toledo Whitmer High School. This will be his 3rd trip of the season already for Ohio State. He was at the Maryland game. He was at the Western Kentucky game. This is a battle still with Michigan, and then you have a couple SEC teams in there, Andrew. But, like, if we're talking potential commitment watch this weekend, the only guys I would really circle on it would be Eli Lee, the linebacker from Akron-Hoban, and Carter Lowe, who he certainly isn't in a point where he's like, I want to get this over with, but I could see it happening because the relationship that he has with Ohio State right now is better than he has with anyone else. And I don't think it's particularly close.
Yeah. I mean, that would be getting him on board potentially early like this, if it were to happen, would be immense for Justin Fry and Ryan Day, given some of the struggles they've had at the offensive tackle spot right now. Kind of like a Jordan Marshall-ish type of recruitment in that it's probably going to be Ohio State or Michigan. So that's one that they absolutely have to win for 2025, I'd say.
Yeah, and the difference, of course, is that this is not one where Ohio State was asleep for the first 8 months of it.
Exactly.
So you have a little bit of a change of pace there. Brian Hartline obviously has all three of his wide receiver commitments in the class of 2024 in town. He has wide receiver Javen Boggs in town in the class of 2025, but he also has some big time dudes visiting in the class of 2025 alongside Boggs. Number one is Jamie French from Florida, is an Alabama commitment. I think he's the best receiver in the country in the class of 2025. Nashawn Montgomery from Florida, Dalen McCutcheon from Texas. These are studs. That is a really good group for Brian Hartline to get an opportunity to spend some time with. The biggest one is French, as I said. He committed to Alabama in the summer, and it was a little bit premature, I think, in most people's minds. He did that like a week before he was supposed to visit Ohio State and then didn't. He's coming up with a group of people that include Jeremiah Smith and Byron Lewis, the running back in the class of 2025, Waltez Clark, the running back in the class of 2025, committed to Florida. So it's an interesting weekend for Brian Hartline because outside of Javen Boggs, it has been a little bit of a slower evaluation in 25 at wide receiver because there just hasn't been that guy other than French who really stands out nationally. And the Buckeyes had not really known where they stood. So this is a weekend where they can hopefully get back involved there. And as you look at Alabama's offense, Andrew, it's not like they're lighting the world on fire. You don't know how things are going to go with Tommy Rees in 2 years by the time that this receiver would be there. So it's just a very important weekend for relationships.
Yeah, today's news that French is going to be on campus is just huge for a number of reasons. Like you said, he's probably the best receiver in the country for 2025, and that board is very much still being pieced together. And then it's right in the middle of Alabama's struggles on offense. And it doesn't help that Jalen Milroe is, more of a runner than a passer, but this is a huge opportunity for Brian Hartline. And if you're Alabama, you can't feel too great about this visit going down this weekend.
Yeah, I'm sure they would have preferred it not happen. As I mentioned, Byron Lewis, Waltez Clark will be in town, but so will Marquise Davis, again, the running back from Cleveland Heights, who we talked about a lot a week ago. It's a fascinating breakdown in the class of 2025 at running back for Ohio State. I think they're going to want 2 players in that class still, but some of that depends on how things go with Sam Williams-Dixon and Jordan Lyle and James Peoples, who will all be in town this weekend as well. And it's an opportunity for Marquise Davis to A, see how he fits in with those guys, and B, you sort of get a chance to size those dudes up and see exactly, hey, how do I stack up with these kids? Marquise is extremely confident, but as I said last week, I think he wants to be the lone running back in the class. So you have to see how Ohio State navigates this. It is worth noting that like Bo Jackson, the other in-state running back that has an Ohio State offer, is not visiting this weekend. So they're at least, you can read that into that however you want, but I think there is some separating happening in the minds of Ohio State as far as in-state tailback options. Out of state, Waltez Clark and Byron Lewis are certainly on the board, but neither one of them are at the same level of Jordan Davison out in California. So we'll see if Davison gets on campus with Ohio State, anytime soon.
And like national powers, when it comes to running back recruiting, only taking a single back is sort of rare these days. So I just wonder if there's any programs that are going to be like, yeah, we're only going to take one and it's going to be you. So it's kind of an interesting approach, I'd say.
Yeah. Bottom line, again, Ohio State's expecting over 80 players this weekend. On the 2024 list and the 2025 list, we've listed about 45 of them. There's certainly going to be other guys showing up that we just don't know at this point. But it's shaping up to be pretty big. I know the questions are going to come about Devin Sanchez and, where does that go from there? Is there any chance he could commit this weekend? I would say that there's a chance, but I wouldn't count on it. As I said, I think Eli Lee, I'll be pretty surprised if that one gets much beyond this weekend without him committed. And then we'll see if the Buckeyes can seal the deal with Carter Lowe, because that's a real big one.
Yeah, it's best to just go into these weekends with low expectations in terms of commitment numbers and that kind of thing. And then
immediate commitments, right?
Yeah, immediate commitments. The quick turnaround time doesn't happen all these times. And if it does, then, be thrilled with that, but don't expect it, I'd say.
Yeah. Again, to me, the biggest storyline here is the defensive backs. If you look at these guys, that is huge. and then the linebackers. I think that this is a real big weekend. James Laurinaitis and Jim Knowles absolutely love Madden Faramo when he visited in the summer and camped for the Buckeyes. That's probably going to end up vibing out to be similar to the Kingston Viamuasa recruitment, where it's Ohio State, Notre Dame, and USC, I think will be the big three that are in that fight. So it kind of feels like Notre Dame may have a little bit of the lead in that battle right now. But in a run game weekend where you should see a lot of reps and a lot of plays made by Tommy Eichenberg, and the Ohio State linebackers, it's a good opportunity for Ohio State to say, this is what we need to replace, and you guys are the guys to do it. Because clearly in the class of 2024, even though Peyton Pierce and Garrett Stover will be in town, the Buckeyes are still stuck on 2 linebackers in that spot. And I'm not sure that either one of those guys is the most like natural fit in the middle, like Faramo is, or like Elijah Melendez is, or even like Anthony Sacco is. So that's the class of 2025. Andrew, what's your storyline in 25? Who are you really like, ooh, tell me more?
I mean, it's just, Sanchez is a huge name, obviously. Just any of those cornerbacks, the Dorian Brew relocation to Texas. What does that mean? Does it mean anything? Is it, not a huge issue in terms of his recruitment and his ultimate destination? So those are the big ones. And like I said, I like seeing Jamie French on campus because that's arguably the best player in the country at his position. And he's going to be meeting with the best coach in the country at the position. So that's a big deal.
Yeah. And it won't hurt to have Jeremiah Smith there as well, the number 1 player in the class of 2024, and Marvin Harrison and all of the other things that Ohio State can throw at you when you're talking wide receivers. We're going to take a quick break. We'll get back here on Talking Stuff with the class of 2026. Andrew, we're talking wide receivers in the class of 2024, 2025, but like there might be the best group of 2026 wide receivers in the country gathered at Ohio State this weekend as well. We'll flash those names on the board real quick. We've got wide receiver Chris Henry Jr. committed to Ohio State. He's from Cincinnati, but beyond that, Jabari Brady, who's a borderline 5-star player from Florida, Aaron Gregory, a borderline 5-star wide receiver from Georgia, and Brody Keefe, who's a really talented wide receiver from North Carolina who visited Ohio State and camped in June and walked away with an offer, are all going to be on campus. So Brian Hartline has to coordinate a pretty big football game this weekend against the Nittany Lions, but he also has to coordinate how on earth to handle the 3 receivers in the class of 2024, 4 receivers in the class of 2025, 4 receivers in the class of 2026. So Zone 6 could be in for quite a workout this weekend.
Yeah, Chris Henry Jr., obviously a freak. We've talked about him a lot, but Jabari Brady's really the name on that list that I'm most familiar with outside of Henry. And when I kind of first started looking at the 2026 names at receiver, I sort of highlighted Henry and Brady as the dream haul. So it's obviously way early for 2026, but anytime you get him around Brian Hartline, it's not a bad thing.
Yeah, it's interesting. Gregory from Georgia is more of like that speed burner, that 6-foot. He's more of the Mylan Graham type in the group. And then you have Brody Keefe, who reminds me a little bit of Troy Stellato when Ohio State was recruiting him. Just a kid that really moves with purpose, explosive as all get out. For a 2026 athlete to come to Ohio State and earn a scholarship in front of Brian Hartline when he wasn't really on the radar coming into that weekend, into that camp, then that's a pretty good sign for Brody Keefe. It's also a big weekend for Ohio State's in-state players in the class of 2026. They're going to see Max Riley back on campus, the offensive lineman from Avon, Sam Greer from Akron-Hoban, and Albert Hill, the cornerback from Akron-Hoban, who all 3 of those guys have an early offer from the Buckeyes. That's big. We're going to see Dia Bell, who is the son of Raja Bell, former NBA great from American Heritage High School down there in Florida. It's what's interesting, and we haven't seen the name Malachi Toney on this list, and he's committed to Miami. He's from American Heritage. Byron Lewis is coming up. Dia Bell is coming up. He's part of the South Florida Express group. He's extremely close with Jeremiah Smith. I'm not saying he's showing up, but I'm just saying, like, I wouldn't be shocked if he did pop in with that group, and it just hasn't been publicized because they don't want Miami to be offended by it or something.
Yeah, that's my favorite thing about these big visit weekends. And I almost envy you, like being on the field. Like, hell, you could turn around a couple hours before the game this week and see Larry Johnson flanked by Dylan Stewart or something like that. Just the surprises that kind of come out of nowhere. That's usually one of my favorite things to kind of follow as these events unfold.
Yeah, it's interesting because again, we've listed I think close to 55 players that we know are coming. Also in the class of 2026, Jura Edwards and Wayne Henry, both teammates of Blake Woodby. Those guys are coming back into town. They were with him for the Maryland game. But you don't know who else is going to show up. And they've told me through the grapevine, I've heard like 80 players. So we're listing about 55. That means there's 25 more out there that could just be anyone showing up, and we just don't know. So that is the rundown. It is a really big recruiting weekend for Ohio State. It is an important game for the Buckeyes to win because of the 2023 Big Ten football race and the national championship pursuit and all that stuff. But it's also an extremely important weekend for fans to understand that if you want to impact a player's recruitment at Ohio State, and I know fans want to do that because they love the Buckeyes and that's their goal. If you're going to the game this weekend, this is how you do it. You show up and you are loud as hell, and you make sure that you're decked out in scarlet like the Ohio State administration wants you to be, and you are supportive and crazy, getting into the stadium early, making sure the recruits that you recognize that you see them and make sure they know that you know who they are. That's how these kids tick. And that's when they start to feel like that real love from schools around the country. And much easier than tweeting at a kid or anything else like that. The best way to really show someone that, hey, Ohio State's fan base is special, Ohio State is special, is by showing up and being super, super loud against Penn State on Saturday.
Yeah, be loud. Call the kid's name if you know their name, but just don't be creepy or weird or anything like that, please.
Yeah, I mean, just be supportive. Rock your colors. Rock your colors. Andrew, this is a little bit different episode of Talking Stuff, so we're not going to do a whole lot more, but we are going to break into the 4-minute offense where we normally are. This is your opportunity. We've got about 5 minutes to talk whatever you want to talk. So what do you want to talk about?
So of the 2024 commits that are not on the visit list this weekend, Justin Scott, is it just one of those things, scheduling conflicts, or is there any not alarm bells, but what are your thoughts on that?
I mean, I think it's a little, I haven't heard the explanation as to why he's not coming to town. I know he was on the early list, but I've also not been given any explanation that would indicate cause for concern. He's not a kid who does a lot of visits. I mean, it's not like he's visiting anywhere else during the season or anything else. The Buckeyes understand that his family doesn't really care about traveling a lot. It's one of the reasons why they wanted to be at a school close to home. So no, there's no concern for Ohio State, but you certainly would like for him and Edric Houston, who's making his second trip to Ohio State in 3 weeks, to have a chance to hang out and to get to know each other a little bit better. But that is the thing. Larry Johnson's recruits are very Larry. They are reclusive. They are a little bit aloof at times, but that doesn't mean that their interest is elsewhere or that they are, something to worry about. It's just not, maybe not worth the trip this weekend. If you're only coming in, you drive from Chicago, you're talking 5.5 hours each way to come watch a game, and not always easy. Yeah,
that's a good point. And we touched on Booker Pickett a little bit earlier, and by the time this, as people are listening to this, he's probably going to be committed to Miami or Florida State. But as far as like the trajectory of where that recruitment went, was it simply just a matter of him being like that weird, not a defensive end, but they don't need just the size of the, just not the typical defensive end size? Do you think that's what it came down to? Because he's a freak when it comes to just simply sacking the quarterback.
Yeah, I mean, he had like 30 sacks as a junior. I think that's all it came down to. It was the same conversation point from the spring visit to now. It's where does he fit? He's 6'5" and 195 pounds. And I guess the question is, how does that work in the Big Ten? And, I think there's an argument to be made that you can sometimes just find a kid and say, let's see what happens and let's watch him grow, especially a kid who has Ohio State, genes. His uncle Ryan Pickett played at Ohio State. His cousin DJ Pickett is maybe the best player in the country in the class of 2025. His younger brother Cannon Pickett is a 2026 offensive lineman that Ohio State really likes. So I think that there's a case to be made that maybe you just say, hey, let's figure it out. But again, that's just not the way Ohio State operates. They don't do that. So they move with purpose, and they do not generally like to be caught up in the game of what if, and that leads to some decisions, I think, where people on the outside rightfully go, that doesn't make a lot of sense. But the Buckeyes were content with where they're at. Obviously, the offer to Deshaun Warner becomes paramount now to win that one, because in most people's minds, I think that's the replacement. If you're looking for a true edge rusher, that's 6'5", 215, 220 pounder. So now that just becomes extremely important to go out there and make sure that you find a way to flip Deshaun Warner from Kansas.
Yeah, makes sense. We'll just end this on just big picture 2024 wrap up stuff. So right now there's 22 commits, 23. What's
22?
Yeah. So offensive line, obviously looking to add a pure tackle. Jordan Seaton's number one guy. Maybe something happens with his kid.
He's visiting Oregon this weekend.
God. We'll see how that goes. Maybe this kid from Northwestern, maybe there's some movement there, but that's way too early to tell yet. Offensively, other than that, pretty much everything's wrapped up, besides maybe wanting to keep the guys they have committed, and then maybe Chance Robinson, maybe something happens with that. We'll see. But that's pretty much where things are at offensively, correct?
Yeah, and Chance Robinson, there was some discussion about him visiting this weekend, and then it was off, and then there was some conversation, well, the whole South Florida group is coming up, so maybe he comes up with them. Still not visiting this weekend. The plan is still for an official visit to happen on the Michigan State game weekend.
Makes sense. And then other side of the ball, defensive line, you got 3 guys in the fold right now, 2 of them being 5 stars, looking for probably a pure edge guy, and then maybe like an Amaris Williams type as well.
Yep.
Linebacker.
Yeah. And linebacker, there's still some conversation about Nicholas Rodriguez. I don't think that's going to happen. The Missouri commitment from South Florida, St. Thomas Aquinas High School, Jordan Lyle, high school teammate. He's dating Jason Taylor's daughter, from what I've understood. So there's a lot more discussion about potentially a flip to Miami than to Ohio State. So I would be kind of on alert for that.
That's one of the weirdest recruiting nuggets you've ever dropped, I think.
Yeah, I mean, these are the things you hear. Linebacker wise, I don't know that there's really anybody else out there. You have to remember, Ohio State did add Nigel Glover 2 weeks before the season started, which is essentially in the class of 2023, but really designed for the class of 2024 as a preferred walk-on in this semester. So like, you do have a little bit of wiggle room there. There's still been discussion about Kobe Black and what could he find a way, because he hasn't decided yet. When Ohio State when Ohio State landed Aaron Scott, Bryce West, and Miles Lockhart, that sort of locked that up, I believe. Now, you could, if Kobe Black was interested in playing safety, sure, maybe you talk about it, but I don't think he is. And I've seen him in the last couple of weeks multiple times on social media make comments when he's seen himself listed on rankings as a safety that he's a cornerback. The Buckeyes are not going to be in the Quentin Redding conversation, who the Virginia Tech commitment I talked about before. That one's over and done with. And now I think you just wait and see if Tyrion Nichols shows up at any point. If he shows up and he makes a visit to campus, I think that's a pretty good sign that he'll flip to Ohio State. But there's no indicator that that's a done deal by any stretch. So you could see 2 more defensive linemen, maybe another safety, and maybe a linebacker to go with what you think could be 1 or 2 offensive linemen. So you could still end up at 27 in this class if everything broke the way that Ohio State's hoping it does.
Yeah, Ohio State ending up with a 27-man class is, I don't want to say hell freezing over, but hey, if they hit on all these guys, I guess that'd be the number. So
it's a new world, man.
Yeah,
new world.
It is. Yeah, I think.
Go ahead.
I was going to say, I think that's it from recruiting side. Big game this weekend, big visits, maybe a big scandal brewing. So lots of stuff happening.
Well, I mean, that's one of the weirder things we've seen in a while. The Michigan Jim Harbaugh, that guy has found a way to piss off the NCAA quite a bit in the last handful of months. And I'm not saying that it means anything for his long-term future or for Michigan's success, but it is weird how a guy who his entire life was viewed as such a down the middle. Now, it's not like he's going out here and paying cash to recruits that it's just those little things that you do to get an edge sometimes, which catch you. And that's where Michigan got in trouble when Harbaugh was there at the start, right? I mean, the extra practice and that sort of stuff. And it always seems like there's just those little steps over the line that you're not supposed to take. That as people who've covered Ohio State and watched Ohio State for our lifetime, like we're pretty familiar with that. The little things that seem like they should be nothing, and they end up blowing up. So who knows? Maybe Jim Harbaugh, maybe this is the excuse he needs to be back in the NFL next year and coaching Justin Herbert and the Chargers or something, you know?
Or the Bengals. We know how much you like Zach Taylor. So
love Zach Taylor. Love him. But we'll see. It's going to be a fun weekend. Lots of stuff happening around Ohio State. Should be a typical fall day in the Midwest, 45, 50 degrees, chance of rain, and one hell of a football game with a big old recruiting list coming to town to watch it. So we'll do our best to keep you apprised of everything that you need to know about that group coming into town. Here on the podcast, if you are a subscriber at rivals.com for ohiostate.rivals.com, you can find out more there. Or on Subtext, we have a lot of different options and ways for you to join us here on the podcast. So thank you for those of you who have already done so. And if you need a reason to, those are them. So for Andrew Ellis, I'm Jeremy Birmingham. This has been Talking Stuff, the Ohio State Recruiting Podcast presented by The Podcast. We will see you next week.